Do we know why the analytics queue just ate itself? That was the first real sentence I heard when I walked into the Monday meeting, still half caffeinated, clutching a reusable mug that said, "Not my circus, not my monkeys." And yet, here we were, smack in the middle of a goddamn monkey riot. But that wasn't the beginning. The beginning was 3 weeks earlier, when Colin Draper showed up with his perfect teeth, his manicured beard, and that little smirk he wore like a fitted suit. New VP of Operations. The kind of guy who'd say "game changer" twice before lunch and use leverage as a verb. I'd worked at Gravistech for almost 9 years, which in tech years is basically Jurassic. But Harold? Harold was ancient. 14 years. Sat in the corner office with no windows, quietly tapping away like he was writing the Code of Hammurabi into our infrastructure. I remember exactly how he looked that morning. Plaid shirt, coffee-stained lanyard, eyes like calm water. We were all herded into the auditorium for Colin's big vision reveal, complete with slide transitions and stock footage of robots shaking hands with humans. "We're modernizing," he said. "AI optimization will allow us to streamline workflows, reduce overhead, and trim non-essential redundancies." No one looked at Harold when the word redundancies came up, except me. That afternoon, HR called him in. 45 minutes later, he walked past my desk carrying a manila envelope and that same beat-up flash drive I'd seen dangling from his keychain for years. I couldn't help myself. "Jesus, Harold, you okay?" He paused, tilted his head like he was listening for something I couldn't hear. Then he gave me a soft smile and said, "They told me the system replaced me." I blinked. "That's, wow, harsh." He shrugged. I asked if I could keep my drafts. That was it. He didn't ask for a review, didn't plead his case, just asked to keep his flash drive. If that doesn't raise the hairs on your arms, it should. Because if Harold ever asked for something, it meant something. Hey, quick pause here. If you're already deep into this story, and I know 97% of you listen without subscribing, take 2 seconds to hit that subscribe button and tap the like. Seriously, it helps the team keep finding these wild stories and giving them the justice they deserve. Anyway, back to Harold. He left with a severance packet that, I later found out, was an insult. 1 lump sum and no consultation retainer. Colin apparently told him, "You're welcome to lawyer up," with that smirk again. HR laughed when Harold pointed out a line in the contract that didn't match the employee handbook. They thought he was bluffing. I thought he was done. But 3 days later, I got a text from him, just a screenshot of a clause titled 8.3. No explanation, no message, just the header. Auto-renewal expiry, owner signed license term required. I didn't know what that meant. Colin didn't either. None of us did. Yet. Harold was the kind of man who wore silence like armor. He didn't fidget, didn't twitch, didn't try to fill space with pleasantries or pointless words. So when he sat across from HR and quietly pointed to the discrepancy on page 5, buried under the non-compete clause and a stack of generic exit ramp boilerplate, I knew something was wrong. Not emotionally, mechanically, like watching a circuit hum just before a capacitor blows. The HR rep, Tanya, blinked twice like she didn't understand. "Clause discrepancy?" she repeated, flipping back with a painted nail. "Harold, this is the standard package. Everyone gets the same." He didn't raise his voice. He just tapped the sentence again. "This paragraph doesn't match the language in the policy revision from 2019. Section 6B, you've omitted the conditional review clause." Tanya smiled that HR smile, tight, professional, slightly dead behind the eyes. That section was sunsetted after the migration. Legal reviewed it. That section was never sunsetted, Harold said simply. Then, just as quietly, but that's fine. From the far corner, Colin Draper leaned back in his stupid ergonomic mesh chair like a discount Bond villain. You're welcome to lawyer up, Harold, but I'd spend that time finding your next opportunity. He grinned. AI's already doing most of your old job anyway. Harold stared at him, calm as still water. May I have a printed copy of everything I signed today? Sure, Tanya said, already annoyed. She slid a stack from the printer tray without looking. And may I keep the flash drive on my keychain? It's personal. Colin snorted. Take your mixtape, man. It's 2025. Who even uses USBs? Harold said, thank you, stood up, and walked out without looking back. I watched him from the window near the espresso machine, mid-December drizzle smearing the parking lot lights, his coat buttoned, his walk unhurried. He sat in his car for a while, long enough to be noticed. Then, with the kind of precision that only comes from years of habit, Harold opened his laptop, plugged in that flash drive, and launched a folder labeled Foundry Merger V2 Final. Inside was a document with a black bar across the top. Proprietary license stack, authored terms, deployment keychain. My stomach dropped. Back when Gravistech absorbed FoundryNet 6 years ago, we all thought it was just a quiet acquisition of a dying startup's infrastructure. What nobody knew, what I didn't even know, and I'd sat in on some of those migration calls, was that Harold had written the deployment stack that served as the skeleton for our internal systems today. CRM, inventory, payroll, order processing, all stitched together with a runtime framework FoundryNet had customized in-house. Harold had been part of that deal, and apparently he'd retained more than just memory of the code. He'd kept authorship, he'd also kept a copy, and he'd embedded license terms no one ever bothered to review, because who checks under the hood when the engine still starts? Clause 8.3 wasn't just about renewal, it was about authority. Terms couldn't auto-renew without the original architect's sign-off. It was baked into the logic like a kill switch, silent, inert, invisible until the timer hit 0. Harold didn't storm out. He didn't post angry Glassdoor reviews or throw shade on LinkedIn. He didn't even mention what he'd built. He just highlighted clause 8.3 with a yellow marker, closed the laptop, and drove off like nothing happened. But something had. We just didn't know it yet. Harold always said the trick to surviving in tech was not in being seen, but in knowing where the wires ran underground, where the real switches were, where the fools thought it was safe to dig. On his last day, long after his badge stopped working, after the security team awkwardly walked him out with a half-hearted, "Good luck out there," he drove home in silence, parked the car, walked straight into his den, and opened a dashboard no one else knew existed. It looked like nothing, just a gray interface with green dots and a banner at the top that read, License Authority, LAV. Underneath it, a timer, 7 days remaining. 7 days until the license chain Harold had authored, signed and bound by contract during a now-forgotten merger, would hit its expiry. 7 days until each dependent service began peeling away from the system like old paint. Not all at once, not like a bomb, but like a patient shutting down, organ by organ. Harold sat back, one leg crossed over the other, fingers resting quietly on the keyboard, No gloating, no schemes, just observation, just curiosity. He had built the bones. They never asked where the marrow came from. The next morning, Gravis Tech released a press statement. Gravis Tech unveils fully autonomous stack, reduces legacy dependencies by 83%. It was picked up by Tech Times, reblogged by Codefluencers who parroted whatever buzzwords sounded disruptive enough. In the banner photo, Colin Draper stood with arms crossed and that smug, teeth-baring grin. The man looked like he'd swallowed a TED Talk and thought it made him an engineer. By leveraging AI automation, the article quoted, we've trimmed dead weight and optimized every core function of our backend systems. Redundancy is no longer a luxury, it's a liability. Harold read it while eating cereal. Bran flakes, dry, no milk. The man treated flavor like a distraction. He scrolled down to the comments, saw one from a user named SizeDoc223 that read, hope they remembered to map their renewal dependencies before ditching legacy. LOL. He chuckled once, just air through his nose, and closed the tab. What no one at Gravis Tech realized was that their stack, while humming along beautifully, wasn't licensed for independent runtime beyond the term cap. They had runtime permissions, but only through layered dependency grants. That's what Harold had architected 6 years ago when they absorbed Foundry Net. It was brilliant in its simplicity and terrifying in its implications. Their entire infrastructure had an invisible clock ticking in the background. And now? It was at 6 days, 21 hours, and some change. Back at HQ, Colin was doing rounds on LinkedIn Live, talking about how the future of ops was AI first, people last. I watched one of his clips where he laughed about legacy tech being like carrying around an old Tamagotchi, just feed it, reboot it, and pray it doesn't die. In that same breath, someone from sales messaged me, asking why some of our analytics queues were returning null on overnight queries. I didn't know. The DevOps team didn't either. By Friday, little anomalies began stacking like dust no one noticed until they sneezed. Sync hiccups. CRM delays. A minor warehouse order tagged as unconfirmed, despite processing cleanly the night before. Someone joked about Mercury in retrograde, but I started to wonder. Not because anything big had broken, but because no one seemed to understand how the system was actually stitched together. Everyone had assumed it was automated. No one questioned the idea that autonomy didn't mean independence. It just meant they'd forgotten who had the keys. Harold hadn't broken anything. He was just watching, and the timer kept counting down. Friday morning started with a nervous laugh from the intern managing our server monitor feed. Did anyone else's heartbeat skip when the analytics dashboard flashed red for like a second? He joked. Everyone chuckled. But then someone from fulfillment chimed in that their overnight batch report never auto-synced. Another dev mentioned the sync times on the East Coast node were lagging by 17 minutes. No big deal, just weird. Must be the weather, someone muttered. Because when nobody has answers, weather is always a safe villain. By noon, the floor had gone from breezy to tight-lipped. The systems weren't failing, but they weren't snapping either. It was like watching a high-performance engine slowly lose compression, just enough to make you wonder if you heard something off. That's when Logan, our youngest full-stack hire, fresh out of college, still wearing conference swag and using dark mode like a personality trait, slid into Harold's LinkedIn inbox. It was a Hail Mary. His message read, Hey, Harold. Random Q. Do you happen to know where the license renewal credentials were stored? Can't seem to find them in the vault. Appreciate any breadcrumbs, LOL. It wasn't LOL funny. It was desperation disguised as friendliness. Harold didn't answer right away. He took his time. I imagine him leaning back in his chair, maybe sipping one of those unsweetened iced teas he always had. Cracked plastic label, no frills. The man was nothing if not deliberate. 2 hours later, Logan received a single-line reply. Check the clause index, start with 8. No emojis, no fluff. Logan showed it to me, eyes wide like he'd just been handed a puzzle box with no clear edges. Clause index? He repeated. We have a clause index? We did. Somewhere. Maybe in legal's basement, or maybe only Harold ever had the full copy. All I knew was that Clause 8 wasn't about password recovery. It was about control. That weekend, while the rest of us scrambled across Slack threads and Gantt charts, trying to explain why the order processing latency was spiking without any load increase, Harold hiked through Red River Gorge. I know because he posted one photo, a rock ledge over a foggy ravine, captioned only, "Stillness reveals fault lines." The man was out there in boots and silence, while our infrastructure trembled like a Jenga tower, missing a keystone we hadn't realized he'd removed. Late Saturday night, a network admin noticed that certain license heartbeat pings were no longer returning timestamps. Not failed, not denied, just absent. As if the service had ghosted its own check-in. No one could explain it. And even worse, no one knew who to ask. We kept rebooting caches, clearing logs, running diagnostics that told us everything was green, but it was a lie. Deep underneath, the dependency chain was already peeling. That's when one of the DevOps leads, quiet guy named Felix, said, "What if this is by design?" It shut the room up, because it felt like design, too clean, too methodical. Not some bug, not some freak glitch. This wasn't a fire, it was a slow, cold severing. Harold hadn't just written the license terms, he'd fortified them. Built-in expiration triggers that didn't just shut things off. He'd staggered them, like tripwires on a delay, each one dependent on the last failing, quietly enough to pass undetected. No one could bulk override them because the triggers weren't centralized. They were buried like landmines across subsystems, each keyed to a condition that sounded innocuous unless you understood the full blueprint. And the only one who ever understood the full blueprint was 3 days into a long weekend, watching the timer count down. No one could reach him, not officially. But I had a feeling. He didn't plan to answer. At exactly 11:59 p.m. on Sunday night, Harold Masters sat barefoot at his kitchen table, sipping chamomile tea like a man preparing for a good night's sleep. Not a silent, digital execution. The dashboard glowed dimly on his laptop. No noise, no flashing lights, just a quiet UI that hadn't changed in days. Except for the top banner. License Authority, Live Time. Remaining, Ierzro Ororo 45. The seconds counted down like a heartbeat he could feel more than hear. 44, 43. Outside, the neighborhood was dark. Rain tapped gently against the window panes, and the only sound in the house was the faint hum of the fridge. His phone was off. No alarms, no distractions. At 10 seconds, Harold exhaled and leaned back in his chair, hands folded calmly over his chest like a monk in meditation. 3, 2, 1. License Authority, expired primary node. Offline, ping received timestamp, 0 Taro Eushra. No alarm sounded. No countdown sirens. Just a single line of confirmation. He didn't smile. Didn't speak. Just nodded once, softly, like a conductor giving the final cue in a symphony only he could hear. By 12:05 a.m., minor system anomalies started stacking. The queue that parsed inventory reorders from the vendor database hit a silent timeout. Then, the CRM authentication bridge rejected 3 overnight API calls from the external analytics platform. Nothing flashy, just denials. Quiet refusal. At 12:27, the primary pipeline for order processing failed to respond to its own health check. At 12:39, someone from East Coast Logistics filed a low-priority ticket. Order queue stuck on initiating. Rebooted client, no change. At 12:51, that queue froze entirely. 27 in-flight transactions hung mid-cycle. No refunds. No confirmations. No delivery signals sent. At 1 a.m. sharp, the internal dev tools, everything from bug tracker to deployment console, crashed in cascading sequence. First read-only, then full logout, then 403 errors, then complete silence. The systems didn't explode. They ghosted. All that remained on screen for the dev team's automated dashboard was a single gray box. License terms lapsed. Contact authorizing party. No link, no support line, no fallback. Just that phrase, cold and final. Legal wouldn't realize until the morning that no one ever changed the licensing metadata after Harold left. No one had revoked his digital authorship because no one had ever understood how deep it went. He'd written himself into the bones, quietly, like a signature behind drywall. Harold closed the laptop gently, finished his tea, walked into the bedroom, pulled back the covers, and lay down beside the same woman he'd loved for 3 decades. He slept better that night than he had in years. Back at Gravistech, no one would sleep, because no one knew who the authorizing party was. And the one man who did had already turned the page. Monday hit like a bat to the teeth. By 7:42 a.m., the sales team's group chat was already in full meltdown. Screenshots of 503 errors, frantic voice memos, and one poor guy in Ohio asking why his lead dashboard was showing negative values. At 8:03, someone from billing posted, "Is CRM down for everyone or just me? Also, payroll access is throwing cert errors." By 8:12, it wasn't just CRM. The warehouse ops interface had collapsed. Inventory management returned blanks. Package routing was frozen mid-cycle. Someone in New Jersey had to manually stop a forklift because the auto system defaulted into sleep mode and refused to wake. Colin Draper was nowhere to be found. Radio silence. The man who couldn't shut up about next-gen synergy had apparently flown out to Miami for the weekend and hadn't checked in. Slack showed him as idle since Saturday afternoon. Not that it mattered. Slack itself was inaccessible by 8:25. The emergency bridge call started late because no one could figure out which platform still worked. Zoom crashed. Teams refused to authenticate. Eventually, someone used a dusty GoToMeeting link that hadn't been touched since the pandemic. Legal finally stepped in around 9:10 a.m., looking pale and brittle. They'd reviewed the old license stack metadata from FoundryNet's acquisition and came to a horrifying conclusion. The contract, and every license agreement derived from it, still listed a singular authorizing party for renewals. And it wasn't Gravistech. It was Harold Masters. Not Gravistech employee Harold Masters. Author of record Harold Masters. The difference hit like an elevator cable snapping. because none of the executives had the authority to sign new licensing terms. The stack had been registered through FoundryNet's shell entity, now dissolved, with a conditional clause that transferred control not to the acquiring company, but to the individual license author unless renegotiated within 2 years of acquisition. No one had renegotiated. No one even knew. Colin had approved the termination of the only human who could legally, or technically, authorize the stack's reactivation. And Colin? He was apparently on a boat, or off-grid, or hung over in a hotel suite with bad signal and worse instincts. The CEO landed back at JFK around 10:03 a.m., checked his phone, and reportedly went silent for 4 full minutes on the jetway. 47 voicemails. A few flagged urgent. One marked legal incident, system freeze. Back in the main office, panic was a living thing. Engineers were dragging whiteboards into hallways. Someone tried to brute force the expired stack with a temp license key. It triggered a logic timeout that collapsed the DevOps console for the entire Eastern cluster. And somewhere in the middle of all this, an old email alias blinked to life. Contracts FoundryNet.pro forgotten. Unused, obsolete. Until now. It began receiving ping after ping, automated license renewal requests that had nowhere else to go. The inbox filled steadily. Renewal attempt failed. Retrying authorization. Contact authorizing party. At 11:26 a.m., the first human message arrived. Mr. Masters, if you're still monitoring this inbox, we need to speak. Urgent. By noon, there were 17 voicemails on Harold's personal phone. From old coworkers, from legal, from an engineer who once told Harold to get with the times after he refused to switch to VS Code. Harold didn't answer any of them. He just sat on his porch with a paperback, listening to wind chimes and the far-off chirp of a mockingbird. The phone buzzed once more. He let it ring. Inside, his laptop blinked softly, receiving a final automated report from the alias inbox. Everything was breaking, exactly as designed. The boardroom was dead silent, except for the hum of the ceiling vent and the distant, rhythmic clicking of someone's nervous pen. The CEO, Michael Grafton, leaned forward with both palms flat on the table like he was holding down a corpse that hadn't stopped twitching. His face was red in patches, like someone had just told him his yacht was sinking and the insurance had lapsed. Across from him, a junior legal associate named Priya, no older than 26, slid a thick contract folder across the table. Her hands were steady. Her voice was not. This clause, she said, tapping page 43 with a blue pen, was never amended post-merger. It reads, licensing terms subject to expiration and renewal only under original authorship authority unless redelegated under signature within 24 months of system adoption. No one said anything, she continued. There's no record of delegation, no amendment, which means, as of midnight, we are operating entirely on expired terms. Michael's jaw clenched. And the original author is... Priya pulled out one more sheet. The deployment agreement was signed 6 years ago by Harold K. Masters. A few people blinked. Then someone across the table, head of infrastructure, asked, Who the hell is Harold K. Masters? Priya didn't look up. That would be Harold, our former IT contract specialist, fired 3 weeks ago. The silence that followed wasn't the kind that fills a room. It's the kind that consumes it. Everyone suddenly remembered Harold, the quiet guy in the corduroy shirts, the one who never raised his voice, The one they walked past 1,000 times without looking? The one Colin said was legacy dead weight. Harold was the architect. Not metaphorically. Not in the he helped set things up kind of way. No, legally and structurally, Harold was the only human being who could authorize a license renewal. His signature wasn't just on the old files. It was the key. A literal signing authority baked into the system's logic through a verification check that couldn't be bypassed or spoofed without tripping a fatal chain of integrity flags. Someone whispered, "Where's Colin?" No one had an answer. Michael stood up, grabbed his phone, and walked out without a word. We all knew where he was going. It was mid-morning. Harold was already on his second cup of tea, sitting on the back deck, laptop closed, eyes half-lidded under a ball cap faded from years of sun. The wind carried the scent of lilacs. The phone rang exactly twice. He answered. "Harold, this is Michael Grafton." Harold didn't reply right away, just let the silence linger. He knew that silence wasn't dead air, it was power. "We need to talk," Michael continued, "about the system, about the license. I believe there's been a misunderstanding." Harold's voice was calm, measured. "There's no misunderstanding. The terms expired." Michael exhaled. "Fine. What would it take to get this resolved?" Another pause. Then Harold said it, the same way someone orders soup at a diner. No malice, no edge, just truth. "I'm available for consultation, but my rates have changed." Michael blinked. "How much?" $3.2 million, Harold said flatly. "Up front, plus a 2-year advisory retainer, and I want equity. Class B shares." It was like someone had pulled the emergency brake on a bullet train. On the other end of the call, I imagine Michael looking around that room of pale executives and realizing Harold had just become the board. Because what choice did they have? The CRM was still down. Payroll couldn't verify hours. Order management was locked in a loop of expired tokens. Rebuilding from scratch would take months, and every hour was bleeding money and client trust. Their only exit ramp had Harold's name carved into the concrete. Power didn't shift with fanfare. There was no mic drop, no gotcha moment. Just a quiet voice on the other end of a phone line, sipping tea. Who, after years of being ignored, had simply waited for the silence to speak for him. They booked the conference room on the 12th floor, the one with the glass walls and the pointless espresso machine that had never worked. But this time, nobody offered coffee. No one tried small talk. The tension was cold, professional, surgical. Everyone in that room knew what was about to happen. What none of them were ready for was how Harold walked in. No suit, no tie. Just Harold in his earth-tone windbreaker, laptop bag slung over his shoulder, and that expressionless calm that once got mistaken for indifference. Now they understood it for what it was: control. The board sat in tight rows, faces drawn. The CEO was already there, papers in front of him, jaw set in something between apology and resolve. An empty chair sat at the end of the table. Colin's nameplate was still on it. But Colin wasn't coming. He'd been formally dismissed that morning, escorted out by HR before his badge even deactivated. The official reason? Non-compliant termination of essential infrastructure personnel. Unofficially? He got too cocky and fired the only guy who could keep the lights on. The system he bragged about optimizing had turned off like a light switch because it was never his to control. Harold didn't sit at the empty chair. He plugged in his laptop at the other end of the table and mirrored his screen. A minimalist deck appeared. Black text on white slides, no graphics, no gimmicks. Proposed licensing framework. V2 Slide 1, autonomy through transparency. Slide 2, all renewal rights revert to Gravistech Corporate with a one-time licensing buyout. Slide 3, advisory equity and re-architecture plan to decouple vendor lock-ins. Harold spoke clearly. No fluff, no storytelling, just legal precision with a programmer's cadence. "I'm not interested in ownership," he said, "but I am interested in making sure no one else replicates what happened here. You want freedom from dependency? You'll need to build it." Someone from legal cleared their throat. "And the terms?" Harold didn't blink. 3.2 million upfront. Advisory equity, 0.8% non-voting Class B. 2-year technical oversight. I'll write a replacement licensing model under open governance, no trapdoors, no lock-ins, but I retain the right to audit every 6 months. A board member asked, "What about intellectual property rights on the current stack?" "You never owned it," Harold said simply. "You leased it from a ghost." He clicked to the next slide. Clause 8.3, Sunset Provision, rewritten for full transparency. Nobody interrupted again. He didn't speak of Colin. Didn't reference the HR circus. No retribution, no cheap revenge. Harold's terms weren't emotional. They were evolved. He wasn't settling a score. He was replacing a structure. When he finished, the room was silent. The CEO reached for the contract and flipped through it. 39 pages. Not a single red line. Then, with a pen that cost more than Harold's car, Michael Grafton signed. Not because he agreed, because he had no choice. Harold packed up his laptop. "You'll get the new deployment schedule by Friday?" "Will you be working from here?" someone asked. He paused, looked around the room full of people who had once walked past him like he was office furniture, then said, "No." He didn't need a desk anymore. He had the entire system in his hands, and this time, he wasn't giving it away. A week later, in a quiet co-working loft across town, nothing fancy, just high ceilings and a stubborn espresso machine that Harold somehow got working, he logged into the new dashboard for the first time. The interface was cleaner now. No corporate logo, no stacked integrations. Just a simple title at the top. Open Frame Trust. Infrastructure for the Forgotten. He didn't smile. Harold didn't really do expressions, but there was something in the stillness of his hands, the ease with which his fingers moved across the keys, that suggested a kind of peace. Not victory, just closure. The license model he'd rebuilt from the ground up had no proprietary locks, no one-way doors. It wasn't designed for scaling unicorns or inflating Series B valuations. It was designed for the people who never made it into press releases, the clinics, the schools, the 3-person accounting shops drowning under software fees. Harold had written the terms so they could own their tools, not lease them from black boxes. Everything was open, transparent, auditable. He named the trust after his mother's maiden name. She'd taught high school math and raised him on one income and boxed mac and cheese. She never once called him a failure when he dropped out of his first CS degree. She just handed him a second-hand ThinkPad and said, "Break it until you understand it." That night, over at Gravistech HQ, a new hire started their first shift. Young engineer, fresh from MIT, badge still stiff, eyes wide. They were walking through orientation when they passed the blank terminal near the dev pit. No nameplate, Just an older monitor and a chair nobody sat in anymore. Who was Harold, anyway? They asked. For a moment, no one answered. Then someone from legal muttered, almost reverently, "He built the bones." It wasn't said with regret. It wasn't said with awe. It was said the way you might talk about a stone wall that's outlasted a dozen storms. You don't have to admire it, but you damn well better respect it. Back in his loft, Harold sipped his tea, oolong this time, and watched the first set of license keys get pulled by a non-profit clinic in Des Moines. No emails, no handshakes, no need for thanks. He'd left the stage, but the framework would speak for itself. And as the screen faded to standby and the room dimmed around him, the last words hung quiet and sharp, like a chisel against steel. They thought they replaced me. They just rented my silence and let it expire.